The moment I saw Deborah Fitzpatrick standing on my front lawn with her leather-bound HOA binder and that pinched expression she always wore, I knew my Thursday morning was about to go sideways. I had just finished loading the last crate of heirloom tomatoes into my truck when she cleared her throat loud enough to wake the neighborhood. It was barely 6 in the morning, and already I could feel a headache forming behind my eyes. "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice dripping with false politeness, "we need to discuss your little weekend activity." I set down the crate of zucchini I was carrying and turned to face her. "Good morning to you too, Deborah. What activity would that be?" She flipped open her binder with practiced efficiency, running one manicured nail down a page filled with what looked like photographs and handwritten notes. "The unauthorized commercial operation you've been running out of your property. The farmer's market stand." I leaned against my truck, crossing my arms. "The farmer's market is in the parking lot of Miller's hardware store downtown. Has been for 3 years now. Last I checked, that's not HOA property." "But you're operating it from this residence," she countered, gesturing at my house like it was some kind of criminal enterprise. "Loading and unloading commercial quantities of produce, using your garage for storage, creating traffic in our peaceful neighborhood with your supplier deliveries." "Supplier deliveries?" I almost laughed. "Deborah, I grow everything in my backyard. You know, the same backyard I've been cultivating since I moved here 5 years ago." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Be that as it may, Section 12. Paragraph 7 of the HOA covenant clearly states that no homeowner shall operate a business from their residence without prior approval from the board." "I'm not operating a business from my residence. I'm growing vegetables in my garden and selling them at a public market downtown. That's not the same thing. The board disagrees." She snapped the binder shut with finality. "You'll be receiving a formal cease and desist letter by the end of the day. I suggest you start making arrangements to shut down your operation, or we'll be forced to take further action." I watched her walk away, her heels clicking on my driveway, and wondered how my life had gotten to this point. 3 years ago, I had started the farmer's market stand almost by accident. After my wife Sarah died, I needed something to do with my hands, something to fill the long weekend hours that used to be filled with her laughter and plans. The garden had always been there, but I expanded it, learned about heritage vegetables, started experimenting with different varieties. When my neighbor, old Mr. Chen, suggested I sell my surplus at the new farmer's market downtown, I figured why not. The extra money was nice, but more than that, I enjoyed the community. The conversations with customers, the regular faces who came back week after week, the way people lit up when they tasted a real tomato for the first time in years. Now Deborah Fitzpatrick and her HOA board wanted to take that away. I finished loading the truck and headed downtown, trying to push the confrontation out of my mind. The farmer's market ran every Saturday from April through October in the parking lot behind Miller's hardware store. It was a good location, right off Main Street in downtown Riverside, Illinois, with plenty of foot traffic from the coffee shops and boutiques that had revitalized the area over the past decade. I set up my stand in my usual spot, arranging the tomatoes in neat pyramids, the zucchini and summer squash in wooden crates, fresh basil and herbs in small pots. The early morning sun was already warm, promising another hot August day. "Morning, Warren," called out Patricia Mills, who ran the stand next to mine selling fresh-cut flowers. "You're looking grim. Everything okay?" "HOA troubles," I said, adjusting the chalkboard sign that listed my prices. She rolled her eyes. "Let me guess, Deborah Fitzpatrick. How'd you know?" "Because she tried the same thing with me last year. said my flower arranging business was creating too much traffic. I told her where she could stick her cease and desist letter. What happened? Nothing. I ignored it. She eventually backed off. These HOA types are all bark and no bite. They rely on people being intimidated. I wanted to believe her, but something in Deborah's eyes that morning told me this wasn't going to blow over easily. The market filled up quickly, as it always did on Saturday mornings. By 8 o'clock, I had a steady stream of customers, regulars who knew to come early for the best selection. Mrs. Rodriguez bought her usual 2 pounds of tomatoes. The Johnsons picked up basil and oregano for their weekend cooking. A young couple I didn't recognize spent 20 minutes asking questions about growing techniques before buying half my zucchini supply. Around 10, I noticed Deborah walking through the market with 2 other women I recognized from the HOA board meetings. Linda Carmichael, the treasurer, and Susan Morrison, the secretary. They weren't shopping. They were taking pictures of my stand, pictures of my customers, pictures of me handling transactions. Patricia noticed too. "That's not creepy at all," she muttered. I tried to ignore them, but it was hard not to feel like I was being watched for the rest of the morning. By the time I packed up at 2 o'clock, I had sold nearly everything, as usual. It had been a good day financially, but the presence of the HOA board members had left a sour taste in my mouth. When I got home, there was an envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a formal letter on HOA letterhead, informing me that I was in violation of multiple covenant sections and had until the end of the month to cease all business operations related to my farmers market stand. Failure to comply would result in fines starting at $200 per day. I called my lawyer friend, Marcus Webb, that afternoon. "They can't do this, can they?" I asked, reading him the letter over the phone. "Depends on what your HOA covenant actually says," Marcus replied. I could hear him typing on his computer. "Email me a copy of the covenant and this letter. I'll take a look." I spent the next hour digging through my files until I found the HOA covenant I had signed when I bought the house. It was a dense document, full of legal language about property maintenance, architectural standards, and behavioral guidelines. I scanned the whole thing and sent it to Marcus. He called back an hour later. "Okay, so here's the thing. Section 12 does prohibit operating a business from your residence, but the language is pretty specific. It's talking about businesses where customers come to your home, or where you're manufacturing or producing goods for sale at the residence. You're not doing either of those things." That's what I thought. However, Marcus continued, and my heart sank at that word. They could argue that using your home as a base of operations, storing inventory there, preparing goods for sale, etc., constitutes operating a business from the residence. It's a stretch, but I've seen HOAs push thinner arguments. "So what do I do?" You could fight it. "If they fine you, we can challenge it, maybe get an injunction, but that takes time and money. The other option is to try to get approval from the board. Schedule a hearing, make your case, see if they'll grant you a variance." "Have you met Deborah Fitzpatrick?" Marcus laughed. "Fair point. Look, think about it over the weekend. In the meantime, document everything. Keep records of your sales, take photos of your setup, gather statements from neighbors about whether your activities actually impact them. If this goes to court, we'll need to show that you're not causing any real harm." I spent Sunday doing exactly that. I photographed my garden, my garage setup, my truck loading process. I wrote out a timeline of my farmers market activities. I even knocked on a few neighbors' doors to ask if they had any complaints about my weekend routine. Most people were supportive. The Hendersons 3 doors down said they loved fresh vegetables and sometimes bought from me directly. Old Mr. Chen said my garden was the best-looking one on the block and an inspiration for his own. Even the Pratts, who I had never gotten along with particularly well, said they had no issues with what I was doing. Only one neighbor expressed any concern, and I wasn't surprised to learn that she was good friends with Deborah Fitzpatrick. Monday morning, I called the HOA management office and requested a hearing before the board. The woman who answered, clearly reading from a script, informed me that board hearings were held on the first Wednesday of each month, and that I would need to submit a written request at least 10 days in advance. The next meeting was September 4th, over 2 weeks away. My deadline to cease operations was August 31st, so they can fine me before I even get a hearing, I asked. The board has the authority to enforce covenant violations immediately, she replied in that same monotone voice. The hearing process is for appeals and variance requests. I hung up and called Marcus back. They're going to start fining me before I can even present my case. Then we file for an injunction. I'll draw up the paperwork today. We can have a judge look at this by the end of the week. How much is this going to cost me? There was a pause. Let's not worry about that right now. Focus on preparing your case. That Wednesday, I went back to the farmers market as usual. It was a smaller weekday market, just a handful of vendors, but I had my regulars who appreciated the midweek option. I was setting up when I noticed a man in a suit taking pictures of the market with a professional-looking camera. "Can I help you?" I asked. He looked up, startled. "Just documenting for a client. Public space, all legal." "Let me guess, HOA." He didn't answer, just went back to taking pictures. Patricia walked over after he left. "This is getting ridiculous. Tell me about it." "You know what you should do? Bring your customers to the HOA meeting. Show them this isn't just about you, it's about the whole community." I had been thinking the same thing, but hearing someone else say it made it feel more real, more possible. "You think people would come? Are you kidding? Your customers love you. I've watched them. You're not just selling vegetables, you're giving them an experience. Teaching them about food, about growing, about where their meals come from. People value that." That Saturday, I put up a sign at my stand. "Help save our farmers market. The HOA is trying to shut us down. If you value local produce and community markets, please attend the HOA meeting on September 4th at 7 p.m., Riverside Community Center." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Mrs. Rodriguez read the sign and immediately pulled out her phone. "I'm putting this on Facebook right now." "How dare they try to shut you down?" The Johnsons said they'd be there. The young couple from the previous week said they'd spread the word at their church. By the end of the day, I had dozens of people promising to attend, asking for more details, wanting to know how they could help. Patricia was grinning. "I told you." Over the next week and a half, the movement grew beyond anything I could have anticipated. Someone created a Facebook event page that got shared hundreds of times. A local food blogger wrote an article about the situation that went viral in the Riverside online community. People I had never met were messaging me with offers of support. The day before the HOA meeting, a reporter from the Riverside Press called me. "Mr. Turner, I understand there's quite a controversy brewing over your farmers market operation. Would you be willing to talk about it?" I met her at a coffee shop downtown that afternoon. Jennifer Cole was young, energetic, and clearly passionate about local food systems. She asked intelligent questions about my operation, about the HOA's objections, about what this meant for the community. "The thing is," I told her, "this isn't really about me. It's about what kind of community we want to be. Do we want to be a place that supports local food, local business, community connections? Or do we want to be so bound by rules and regulations that we can't even grow vegetables in our backyards without permission?" But you're not just growing vegetables, she pointed out. You are running a business. Sure, technically, but I'm not hurting anyone. I'm not creating noise or traffic problems. I'm not running a storefront out of my house. I'm doing what people have done for generations, growing food and sharing it with my neighbors. The fact that money changes hands at a public market downtown shouldn't change that. The article ran on the front page of the local section the next morning, Wednesday, September 4th. HOA targets local farmer in covenant dispute. It was fair and balanced, including quotes from Deborah Fitzpatrick about the importance of maintaining community standards and protecting property values. But the tone was clearly sympathetic to my side. I spent the day anxious, checking the Facebook event page obsessively. Over 300 people had clicked interested. Surely they wouldn't all come. The community center meeting room only held about 150 people comfortably. I got there at 6:30, half an hour before the meeting was scheduled to start. The parking lot was already filling up. Inside, Deborah and the rest of the HOA board were setting up at a table at the front of the room, arranging their binders and papers, clearly not expecting much beyond their usual attendance of a dozen or so homeowners. By 6:45, every seat was filled. People were standing along the walls. More were crowding in the doorway. Deborah's face had gone pale. Linda Carmichael kept looking around the room like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Susan Morrison was frantically whispering to the other board members. At 7 o'clock, Deborah banged her gavel and called the meeting to order, but she could barely be heard over the murmur of the crowd. Someone suggested they move to a larger space, but there wasn't one available. The community center's main auditorium was being used for a concert rehearsal. "We'll make do," Deborah said, her voice tight. "Now, this is a homeowners association meeting. I'm not sure why we have so many visitors, but I need to remind everyone that only HOA members in good standing have voting privileges." "We're not here to vote," someone called out. "We're here to support Warren Turner." A cheer went up from the crowd. I felt my face flush. I was sitting in the front row, and Patricia was beside me, grinning like this was the best entertainment she had seen in years. Deborah tried to regain control. "Yes, well, we'll get to Mr. Turner's situation in due course. First, we have the minutes from last month's meeting to approve and then the treasurer's report." "Can we skip to the main event?" someone else shouted. "We all know why we're here." Deborah's face was turning red now. "This is a formal meeting with proper procedures. We will follow the agenda." What followed was perhaps the most painful 20 minutes I had ever experienced. Linda read through a treasurer's report that no one cared about, detailing the HOA's expenses for landscaping and pool maintenance. Someone made a motion to approve the minutes. Someone seconded. It passed. Finally, Deborah cleared her throat. "Now we come to enforcement actions. The board has issued a cease and desist letter to Warren Turner regarding his operation of a commercial farming business from his residence in violation of Section 12, Paragraph 7 of the HOA Covenant." "What violation?" Mrs. Rodriguez stood up, her voice shaking with anger. "He grows vegetables in his yard and sells them downtown. How is that violating anything?" "The covenant clearly prohibits operating a business from one's residence," Deborah replied. "Mr. Turner is using his property to store inventory, prepare goods for sale, and conduct commercial activities." "That's ridiculous," another voice called out. I turned and recognized Tom Johnson, one of my regular customers. "He's got a garden. That's not a business. That's called being a good neighbor and contributing to the community." Deborah banged her gavel. "Sir, you're not an HOA member. You have no standing here." "Actually, I am," Tom shot back. I bought a house on Maple Street 2 months ago, so yes, I'm an HOA member and I have every right to speak. This seemed to throw Deborah off. She shuffled through her papers trying to verify his claim. Susan Morrison leaned over and whispered something to her. I stood up. Can I address the board? Deborah looked like she wanted to refuse, but with a room full of people watching, she had little choice. You have 3 minutes. I walked to the front of the room and turned to face the crowd. Deep breath. I bought my house 5 years ago right after my wife died. I needed a fresh start and Riverside seemed like a good community. Family-oriented, friendly, quiet. I started the garden as therapy, really. Something to keep me busy on weekends. The room had gone quiet. 3 years ago, a friend suggested I sell some of my surplus at the farmer's market. I figured it would be a good way to meet people, be part of the community. And it has been. I've met so many amazing people. I've watched kids try fresh vegetables for the first time. I've taught people how to grow their own food. I've been part of something bigger than myself. I turned to face Deborah and the board. I understand the HOA has rules. I understand there's a covenant. But those rules are supposed to serve the community, not strangle it. I'm not hurting anyone. I'm not lowering property values. If anything, I'm improving this neighborhood by being an active, engaged member of it. I looked back at the crowd. But this isn't just about me. It's about all of you too. It's about your right to access fresh, local food. It's about supporting the kind of community you want to live in. So I'm asking the board to do the right thing. Grant me a variance. Let me continue doing something that benefits everyone. I sat down to applause that Deborah had to bang her gavel 3 times to quiet. That was very touching, Mr. Turner, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. But the board has a responsibility to enforce the covenants equally for all residents. We can't make exceptions just because someone is popular. Then let's vote on it, Tom Johnson called out. The HOA members here, let's vote on whether to grant Warren a variance. Deborah looked panicked. That's not how this works. Variance requests require a full board review, an environmental impact assessment, a survey of affected neighbors. I've surveyed my neighbors, I interrupted. They're fine with it. I have written statements. Written statements that you collected yourself, Deborah scoffed. That's hardly an impartial survey. A man I didn't recognize stood up. He was tall, gray-haired, wearing an expensive-looking suit. Deborah, I think you should hear from the actual neighbors before you make any decisions. Deborah's eyes narrowed. And you are, Robert Henderson. I live 3 doors down from Warren. He turned to address the room. My wife and I have lived in this neighborhood for 15 years. We've seen a lot of neighbors come and go. Warren Turner is hands down the best neighbor we've ever had. He keeps his property immaculate. He's quiet and respectful. And yes, he grows the most beautiful vegetables you've ever seen. The idea that his garden is somehow a problem is absurd. An older man stood up next. James Chen. I live next door to Warren. I've never had a single complaint about anything he does. In fact, he's inspired me to improve my own garden. The whole block looks better because of him. One by one, my neighbors stood up and spoke. Even people who I barely knew, who I had only waved to in passing, came to my defense. It was overwhelming. Finally, Deborah held up her hand. That's enough. The board will take your comments under advisement. We'll reconvene in closed session to discuss this matter and issue our decision within 30 days. 30 days. Patricia was on her feet now. You've had 2 weeks already. What more do you need to discuss? The process takes time, Miss Mills. Or maybe you're just hoping everyone will forget about this if you drag it out long enough. Patricia shot back. The crowd murmured in agreement. Deborah's face was now bright red. She looked to the other board members for support, but Linda and Susan both seemed uncertain, clearly rattled by the turnout and the passionate defense of my operation. Marcus Webb, who had been sitting quietly in the back, stood up. "If I may, I'm Warren Turner's attorney. The board should be aware that we have filed for an injunction against any fines or penalties while this matter is under review. We also have documentation showing that Mr. Turner's activities fall well within the bounds of reasonable residential use under Illinois state law. If the board chooses to pursue this matter further, we're prepared to take it to court, where I'm confident we'll prevail." This was news to me. Marcus hadn't mentioned filing for an injunction yet, but I appreciated the tactical timing of his announcement. Deborah looked like she had swallowed something bitter. "The board will take that under advisement as well." "Actually," Linda Carmichael spoke up for the first time, her voice hesitant, "I think we should discuss this now, in front of everyone. This is clearly a matter of significant community interest." Deborah whipped her head around to stare at Linda. "Excuse me. I'm just saying, maybe we should reconsider our position. Clearly, the community supports Warren. And if his activities are legal under state law, then maybe our interpretation of the covenant is too strict." "The covenant is clear," Deborah insisted. "Is it, though?" Susan Morrison chimed in. She was flipping through her copy of the covenant. Section 12 says no homeowner shall operate a business from their residence. But Warren isn't operating a business from his residence. He's growing a garden and selling the produce elsewhere. That's different. I watched in amazement as the board began to fracture. Deborah looked furious, but she was clearly losing control of the situation. "I move that we grant Warren Turner a variance to continue his current activities," Linda said. "I second," Susan added. Deborah's mouth opened and closed like a fish. "You can't just make motions without proper procedure. We need time to review, to assess." "We've had time," Linda cut her off. "We've been sitting on this for 2 weeks. You've been building a case against Warren like he's some kind of criminal, and for what? Because you don't like that he's doing something productive with his property." "This isn't personal," Deborah sputtered. "This is about maintaining standards." "Whose standards?" Someone from the crowd called out. "Because it seems like the community's standards are just fine with what Warren's doing." Marcus stood up again. "For the record, a motion has been made and seconded. Under Robert's Rules of Order, which I believe this board follows, you're required to hold a vote." Deborah looked trapped. She knew that with Linda and Susan already on my side, the vote would fail. There were 5 board members total, and she only needed to keep 2 of them on her side to block the variance. The other 2 members, Frank Wilson and Gary Martinez, had been sitting quietly throughout the whole debate. "All in favor of granting Warren Turner a variance," Linda called out, clearly taking control of the meeting. "This is out of order," Deborah protested. "All in favor," Linda repeated, raising her own hand. Susan raised hers as well. After a long moment, Gary Martinez raised his hand too. That was 3 votes, a majority. The room erupted in cheers. I felt like I could barely breathe. Patricia grabbed my arm, laughing. Deborah stood up, slamming her binder shut. "This meeting is adjourned." She stormed out, leaving the other board members to deal with the aftermath. Linda and Susan both came over to me, looking apologetic. "I'm sorry it got this far," Linda said. "Deborah has been on a power trip lately, and some of us have been too afraid to push back. But this was too much." "Thank you," I managed to say. "Both of you." The crowd was slow to disperse. People wanted to shake my hand, to tell me how glad they were that things had worked out, to place orders for next week's farmers' market. Mrs. Rodriguez hugged me so tightly I thought my ribs might crack. "You did good, Warren," Patricia said. "You stood up to them." "We all did," I corrected. "I couldn't have done this without everyone here." The reporter, Jennifer Cole, caught me on my way out. How do you feel about tonight's outcome? Relieved, grateful, a little overwhelmed, honestly. Do you think this is the end of it, or will the board continue to challenge you? I thought about Deborah's face as she stormed out. I don't know, I hope so, but I've learned that some people don't let go of things easily. I was right to be cautious. The next morning, I woke up to find a certified letter from Deborah Fitzpatrick's personal attorney. It was a notice of intent to file a recall petition against Linda Carmichael, Susan Morrison, and Gary Martinez for dereliction of duty and failure to uphold HOA covenants. I called Marcus immediately. Can she do this? Technically, yes. Most HOA bylaws have provisions for recalling board members, but it requires a petition signed by a certain percentage of homeowners, usually 20 or 30%, and then a special election. It's not easy to pull off, but if she succeeds, then she could get board members who agree with her position and reverse the variance decision. I felt sick. After everything we had been through, Deborah was still fighting. Over the next few days, I learned that Deborah was going door to door in the neighborhood, trying to gather signatures for her recall petition. She was telling people that the board had acted improperly, that the variance would set a dangerous precedent, that property values would plummet if people started running businesses out of their homes. Most people refused to sign, but some did, either because they genuinely agreed with her or because they didn't want to get on her bad side. Deborah had a reputation for making life difficult for people who crossed her. The Saturday farmers market that week was bigger than ever. The news coverage and social media attention had drawn new customers who wanted to support the cause. I sold out of everything by noon and could have sold twice as much if I'd had it, but the success was bittersweet. I couldn't shake the feeling that Deborah wasn't going to give up, that this fight was far from over. My instincts proved correct the following Tuesday when I received another letter, this time from the HOA management company. Despite the variance granted by the board, Deborah had filed a formal complaint with the county zoning office, claiming that I was operating a commercial agricultural business in a residentially zoned area. Marcus read the complaint over the phone to me. She's really reaching here. Residential zoning doesn't prohibit gardens, even large ones, and you're not selling from your property, which is usually what triggers zoning violations. So, what happens now? The county will probably send an inspector out to look at your property. As long as everything is clearly a residential garden and not a commercial farm, you should be fine. How big is your garden? About a quarter acre, maybe a little less. It's just the backyard. That's totally reasonable for residential property. Don't worry too much about this. It's just another delay tactic. The county inspector came out the following week. His name was Dan Rogers, a friendly middle-aged man who seemed more interested in my growing techniques than in finding violations. "Nice setup you've got here," he said, walking through the rows of raised beds. "My wife keeps trying to get me to do something like this in our yard." "It's therapeutic," I told him. He took some measurements, made some notes on his clipboard, took a few pictures. "Look, between you and me, this is clearly a residential garden. You've got maybe 30 raised beds, some herb planters, a small greenhouse. Nothing here suggests commercial agriculture. Commercial would be tractors, irrigation systems, outbuildings, employees. This is just a guy who really likes gardening. So I'm in the clear. As far as zoning goes, yeah. I'll write up my report and send it to the county. They'll close the complaint. Honestly, I'm not sure why anyone thought this was worth reporting in the first place." "HOA dispute," I explained. He rolled his eyes. "Say no more. I've seen HOAs go after people for the most ridiculous things. Had one case where they tried to fine a guy for having too many flowers in his front yard. Flowers. said it violated some aesthetic standard. What happened? Judge threw it out, told the HOA to find something better to do with their time. Most of these things don't hold up when they get to court because they're based on someone's personal vendetta rather than any real community concern. His words were reassuring, but I was exhausted. The constant fighting, the letters, the complaints, it was wearing me down. I had started the garden and the farmer's market stand as a way to find peace after Sarah's death. Now it had become a source of stress and conflict. That weekend, I seriously considered just giving it up. Maybe it wasn't worth it. Maybe I should just scale back the garden, stop doing the farmer's market, avoid the hassle. But on Saturday morning, when I pulled up to the market and saw the crowd of people already waiting for me to set up, I couldn't do it. These people had become like family. Mrs. Rodriguez and her stories about cooking for her grandchildren. The Johnsons who were teaching their kids about healthy eating. The young couple who had just bought their first house and wanted to start their own garden. I couldn't let Deborah Fitzpatrick take this away from all of us. The recall petition failed. Despite Deborah's efforts, she couldn't gather enough signatures. Most homeowners either actively opposed the recall or simply didn't care enough to get involved. Linda, Susan, and Gary remained on the board, but Deborah wasn't done. At the October HOA meeting, she proposed a series of new covenant amendments that would explicitly prohibit the cultivation of vegetables for commercial purposes and the use of residential property for any activity related to commercial food production. "This is insane," Gary Martinez said when he read the proposed amendments. "We just went through all of this. The community clearly doesn't support this." "The community doesn't understand the precedent we're setting," Deborah argued. "If we allow Warren to run his farming operation, what's next? Someone opening a bakery, a catering business. Where do we draw the line?" "Warren isn't running a farming operation," Susan countered. "We've been over this 100 times." "Then let's put it to a vote of all homeowners," Deborah said. "Let everyone decide if they want to live in a community where people can run businesses out of their homes." The special election was scheduled for November 15th. All homeowners would receive a ballot in the mail asking them to vote yes or no on the proposed covenant amendments. A 2/3 majority was required for the amendments to pass. Marcus wasn't happy about this development. "The problem with putting it to a general vote is that most people won't care enough to vote at all. And the ones who do vote will be the ones with strong feelings, which could include Deborah's supporters. You need to run a campaign." "A campaign?" "Yes. You need to educate homeowners about what these amendments would actually do, get people motivated to vote against them. Otherwise, Deborah might actually win this." So I became a campaigner. I designed flyers explaining my position and why the amendments were too broad. I set up a website with information and facts. Patricia and some of my other supporters helped distribute door hangers throughout the neighborhood. The opposition wasn't sitting idle either. Deborah's group, which she had dubbed Citizens for Community Standards, was running their own campaign. Their flyers featured pictures of my garden with captions like, "Is this what you want next door?" and "Protect your property values, vote yes on the amendments." It was exhausting and demoralizing. I felt like I was running for political office rather than just trying to grow vegetables. The local media picked up on the story again. Jennifer Cole wrote a follow-up article about the election, framing it as a battle between community engagement and strict rule enforcement. A local TV station did a segment about it, interviewing both me and Deborah. Watching Deborah on TV was surreal. She sat in her perfectly decorated living room, looking concerned and reasonable. "This isn't about Warren specifically," she told the interviewer. "It's about maintaining the character of our neighborhood." People bought homes here expecting a certain standard, and we have a responsibility to maintain that. When they interviewed me, I tried to stay calm and measured. I think the question residents need to ask themselves is what kind of community do they want to live in? One that's rigid and rule-bound, or one that's flexible enough to embrace positive activities that benefit everyone. The ballots went out the first week of November. They had to be returned by November 15th to be counted. Those 10 days felt like the longest of my life. I continued running my farmer's market stand every Saturday. Business was actually better than ever, partially because of all the publicity. But I couldn't enjoy it, knowing that my ability to continue could be taken away by a vote. The night before the deadline, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake thinking about everything that had happened over the past few months. The confrontation with Deborah on my lawn, the packed HOA meeting, the county inspector, the endless letters and complaints and campaigns. Part of me wondered if moving to a neighborhood without an HOA might have been smarter. But another part of me was glad this had happened. It had shown me the strength of community when people come together. It had connected me to my neighbors in ways that might never have happened otherwise. It had given me purpose and fight at a time when I was still healing from Sarah's death. The votes were counted on November 16th at a special board meeting. Once again, the community center was packed. The tension in the room was palpable. Linda Carmichael, as treasurer, was in charge of counting the ballots. The process took over an hour. Every ballot had to be verified, checked against the list of homeowners in good standing, and sorted into yes, no, or invalid piles. Finally, Linda stood up to announce the results. The room went silent. Total ballots cast 412. For context, we have 638 homes in the HOA, invalid ballots 7, valid ballots 405. She paused, taking a breath. Votes in favor of the amendments 131. Votes against the amendments 274. It took a moment for the math to register. Then someone shouted, "He won!" The room erupted. Patricia hugged me. People I barely knew were shaking my hand, patting me on the back. I felt tears stinging my eyes and didn't bother to hide them. A 2/3 majority would have required 270 votes in favor, Linda continued, raising her voice to be heard over the celebration. The amendments have failed by a significant margin. I looked across the room at Deborah. She was sitting alone, her face pale, staring at the table in front of her. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. She had invested so much time and energy into this fight, and she had lost decisively. But then I remembered all the stress she had put me through, all the nights I couldn't sleep, all the money I had spent on legal fees. My sympathy evaporated. After the meeting, I went out for drinks with Patricia, Marcus, and several of my supporters. We toasted to victory and to community. Marcus assured me that with such a decisive vote, it was unlikely Deborah would try anything else. She knows she doesn't have the support, he said. At this point, continuing to fight would just make her look petty and vindictive. But Marcus underestimated Deborah's dedication to her cause. In December, I received notice that Deborah had filed a lawsuit against me personally, separate from the HOA. She was claiming that my garden activities had damaged her property values and created a private nuisance. She was suing for $25,000 in damages, plus an injunction prohibiting me from continuing my farmer's market operation. Marcus was incredulous when I showed him the lawsuit. "This is frivolous. She's going to get laughed out of court. Can she do this? Just sue me personally." Anyone can file a lawsuit. The question is whether it has any merit, and this one doesn't. You'll need to respond, and we'll probably have to go through some preliminary hearings, but I'd be shocked if a judge doesn't dismiss this quickly. The lawsuit was set for a preliminary hearing in February, after the farmers' market's winter break. I spent the holidays trying not to think about it, but it was always there in the back of my mind. The hearing was held on a cold Tuesday morning at the county courthouse. Marcus and I sat at one table, Deborah and her attorney at another. The judge, a stern-looking woman named Margaret Phillips, reviewed the complaint with obvious skepticism. "Miss Fitzpatrick," Judge Phillips said, "you're claiming that Mr. Turner's vegetable garden has damaged your property values. What evidence do you have to support this claim?" Deborah's attorney, a slick-looking man named Richard Stone, stood up. "Your Honor, we have an appraisal showing that properties in the neighborhood have not appreciated at the rate of comparable neighborhoods in the area. We believe this is due to the commercial activities being conducted at Mr. Turner's residence." "Have you established any causal link between the garden and property values?" the judge asked. "The correlation is clear, Your Honor." "Correlation is not causation, Counselor. Do you have any actual evidence that buyers are avoiding this neighborhood specifically because of a vegetable garden?" Stone shuffled through his papers. "We have concerns expressed by potential buyers. You have documentation of these concerns, statements from real estate agents, anything concrete?" "The concerns have been reported to my client by neighbors." Judge Phillips sighed. "So hearsay about hearsay. What about your nuisance claim? What specific nuisance are you alleging?" "The increased traffic, the commercial activities. The garden is in Mr. Turner's backyard, correct? And the sales take place at a public market downtown, not at his residence." "Yes. But then how is this a nuisance to your client?" Stone was floundering. "The principle of the matter, Your Honor. The fact that commercial activities are being conducted in his backyard and at a public market, neither of which affects Miss Fitzpatrick's use and enjoyment of her property." Judge Phillips looked at Deborah directly. "Miss Fitzpatrick, why are you really here?" Deborah stood up, ignoring her attorney's attempt to stop her. "Because this is wrong. He's violating the spirit of our community covenants. He's setting a precedent that will destroy our neighborhood. Someone needs to stand up for standards and rules." "The HOA's board voted to grant him a variance," the judge pointed out. "The homeowners voted against amendments that would have prohibited his activities. It seems like the community has spoken, and they disagree with your position. The community doesn't understand what they're allowing. Or perhaps you don't understand that communities are allowed to evolve, and that not everyone shares your particular vision of what a neighborhood should be." Judge Phillips closed the file. "Miss Fitzpatrick, I'm going to be blunt. This lawsuit is frivolous. You have no evidence of damages, no legitimate nuisance claim, and no legal standing to prohibit activities that the community has explicitly endorsed. I'm dismissing this case with prejudice, which means you cannot refile it. But furthermore, I'm ordering you to pay Mr. Turner's legal fees. Maybe that will discourage you from filing baseless lawsuits in the future." I felt Marcus grip my arm, trying to contain his grin. Deborah looked like she had been slapped. Her attorney was gathering his papers quickly, clearly wanting to get out of the courtroom as fast as possible. Outside the courthouse, Marcus couldn't stop smiling. "That was beautiful. Judge Phillips doesn't put up with nonsense, but I didn't expect her to come down that hard. The with prejudice ruling and the legal fees, that's the court's way of saying this was a waste of everyone's time. So it's really over. It's really over. Deborah has no more moves. She's tried everything, the HOA, the county, a personal lawsuit. She's lost every single time, unless she wants to appeal to a higher court, which would be throwing good money after bad. She's done. I wanted to feel relieved, but mainly I just felt tired. The past 6 months had been an emotional roller coaster. All I wanted was to get back to my garden and my farmer's market, and the simple pleasure of growing food for people who appreciated it. The farmers' market season started up again in April. On opening day, there was a banner hung across the entrance. "Welcome back, Warren. Thanks for fighting for our community." I had to stop and collect myself before I could start setting up my stand. Mrs. Rodriguez was there waiting for me, as always. "We missed you," she said, hugging me. I missed this too. The season was incredible. Business was better than ever. The publicity from the lawsuit had brought in new customers from all over the area. People drove from neighboring towns to buy from that farmer who fought the HOA. In June, the HOA held its annual meeting to elect board members for the coming year. Deborah Fitzpatrick chose not to run for re-election. In fact, she put her house on the market shortly after and moved out of the neighborhood by August. Linda Carmichael was elected as the new HOA president. One of her first actions was to establish a community garden committee to explore creating shared garden spaces for homeowners who wanted to grow their own food, but didn't have the space or knowledge to do it themselves. She asked me to chair the committee. By the following spring, we had converted an unused common area into a community garden with 20 individual plots. I taught monthly workshops on vegetable growing, composting, and season extension. The garden became a gathering place for neighbors who might never have met otherwise. The irony wasn't lost on me. Deborah had tried to shut down my garden, and instead, her actions had led to even more gardening in the neighborhood. On a Saturday morning in July, 2 years after that first confrontation on my lawn, I was setting up at the farmer's market when a young woman approached me nervously. "Mr. Turner, I'm Emma. I just bought a house in Riverside in the Oakmont HOA development. I want to start a small farmer's market stand, but I'm worried about HOA issues. Do you have any advice?" I smiled and set down the crate of tomatoes I was holding. "I do. First, know your rights and your covenant. Second, don't be afraid to stand up for what's right. Third, remember that you're not alone. Community is stronger than any HOA rule." Did you ever regret fighting back? I thought about that question. The stress, the legal fees, the sleepless nights. But I also thought about the friendships I had made, the community that had come together, the precedent we had set. Not for a second. She thanked me and bought some tomatoes. As I watched her walk away, I thought about Sarah, and how she would have loved seeing how the garden had brought people together. She had always believed in the power of community, of neighbors helping neighbors, of people standing up for what mattered. In a way, this whole fight had been as much about her legacy as it had been about my garden. The farmer's market was bustling now, the late morning sun warm on my shoulders. Patricia waved from her flower stand. Mrs. Rodriguez was telling someone about her grandson's latest achievement. Tom Johnson was asking about heirloom tomato varieties for his new garden. This was what Deborah had tried to destroy. Not just a business or a garden, but a community. And she had failed because communities can't be destroyed by rules and regulations. They're built on relationships and shared values and people caring about each other. As I sold the last of my zucchini to a customer I'd never seen before, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: contentment. The kind of deep, settled contentment that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing. The customer handed me cash and said, "I heard about your fight with the HOA. That took guts." "It wasn't just me," I replied. "It was everyone who showed up, everyone who voted, everyone who refused to let someone else define what our community should be. Still, you started it. You stood up first." Maybe that was true, but standing up had never been the hard part. The hard part had been continuing to stand when everything seemed to be against me, when the easier path would have been to give up and give in. The afternoon wound down, and I started packing up my unsold inventory. It wasn't much, just a few bunches of herbs and some cherry tomatoes. As I loaded the truck, I noticed a family I didn't recognize walking through the market, parents with 2 young kids in tow. The little girl, maybe 6 years old, stopped at my stand and picked up one of the remaining tomato containers. "Mommy, can we get these? They're so pretty." Her mother smiled. "Sure, honey." She looked at me. "Are you Warren Turner?" "I am. We just moved to Riverside last month. Everyone told us we had to come to this farmer's market and meet you. They said you grow the best vegetables in Illinois and that you fought the HOA to keep this market going." "I don't know about the best vegetables in Illinois," I said, handing the tomatoes to the little girl. "But yeah, there was an HOA situation. It worked out in the end. Well, we're grateful. There's nothing like this near our old place. My kids are actually excited about eating vegetables now." I watched them walk away, the little girl clutching her container of cherry tomatoes like treasure. This was what it was all about. Not the money or the recognition, or even the victory over Deborah. It was about moments like this, about making a small difference in people's lives through something as simple as fresh food and human connection. By the time I drove home that afternoon, the sun was starting to lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the neighborhood. My neighborhood. The place I had fought to remain a part of, not just as a resident but as an active, contributing member. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment, looking at my house. It was just a house, nothing special, but it represented something more now. It represented the idea that individuals could stand up to arbitrary authority, that communities could come together around shared values. That sometimes the right thing to do was also the hard thing to do. Inside, I made myself dinner from my garden, a simple meal of grilled vegetables and fresh herbs. As I ate, I thought about the journey I had been on since Sarah's death, the grief that had led me to the garden that had led me to the farmer's market that had led me to conflict with the HOA, the conflict that had led me to community. It was all connected, I realized. Every struggle, every victory, every setback had been part of a larger pattern, a larger purpose. Sarah used to say that life had a way of taking you where you needed to go, even if the path wasn't always clear. She would have been proud of what I had built here. Not just the garden or the business, but the community, the relationships, the stand I had taken for something that mattered. The next morning was Sunday, my day to work in the garden without the pressure of preparing for market. I spent hours among the raised beds, weeding and pruning and planning for the fall planting. The work was meditative, grounding, exactly what I needed. Around noon, I heard voices from the front yard. I walked around to find Emma, the young woman from the market, standing with an older couple. "Warren, I hope we're not intruding," Emma said. "These are my parents. They're helping me plan my garden, and I was telling them about you. They wanted to meet you." "Not intruding at all," I said, wiping dirt from my hands. "Would you like to see the backyard?" I spent the next hour giving them a tour, explaining my setup, answering questions about soil preparation and pest management and crop rotation. Emma's father was particularly interested in the greenhouse, asking detailed questions about temperature control and season extension. "You know," he said as they were leaving, "what you've done here is inspiring." My daughter was so nervous about standing up to her HOA, but you've shown her it's possible. You've shown all of us it's possible. After they left, I stood in my garden, surrounded by plants I had nurtured from seeds, and felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. This was my legacy now. Not just the vegetables I grew or the customers I served, but the example I had set. the proof that ordinary people could fight back against unreasonable rules and win. The summer rolled on, hot and productive. Every Saturday, the farmers' market thrived. Every week, I met new people and reconnected with regulars. The community garden committee meetings were lively and productive. We were planning to add more plots the following year and maybe start a seed library. In September, I received an unexpected letter. Not from the HOA, but from a regional farmers market association. They wanted to give me their Community Leadership Award for exemplary dedication to local food systems and community engagement. The award ceremony would be in October, and I was invited to speak about my experience. I called Marcus to tell him, "You should come to the ceremony. You were a huge part of this." "I'll be there," he promised. "But Warren, this is your moment. You're the one who stood up when it mattered." The ceremony was held at a hotel conference center in downtown Chicago. I wore my only suit, feeling uncomfortable in the formal clothes. But when I saw the room full of farmers, food advocates, and community organizers, I relaxed. These were my people. When my name was called, I walked to the podium and looked out at the crowd. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Then I thought about Deborah standing on my lawn that morning, telling me to shut down my operation. I thought about the community flooding the HOA meeting. I thought about Judge Phillips dismissing the lawsuit. I thought about the little girl excited about cherry tomatoes. "When I started my garden," I began, "I was just trying to fill empty hours after my wife died. I never imagined it would lead to a fight with my HOA, or a community movement, or standing here receiving this award. But that's the thing about doing work that matters. It has a way of becoming bigger than yourself." I talked about the importance of community support, about knowing your rights, about not being intimidated by people who hide behind rules to enforce their personal preferences. I talked about the responsibility we all have to stand up for what we believe in, even when it's hard. "The real award isn't this plaque," I said, holding it up. "It's the relationships I've built. It's the customers who have become friends. It's the community that came together to defend something we all valued. That's what makes all of it worthwhile." The applause was warm and genuine. Afterwards, dozens of people came up to share their own stories of HOA battles, zoning disputes, and fights to preserve community spaces and local food systems. Each story reminded me that my experience wasn't unique. Across the country, people were fighting similar battles against rules that prioritized uniformity over community, control over creativity. Driving home that night, the award in a bag on my passenger seat, I felt grateful. Grateful for the struggle that had made me stronger. Grateful for the community that had supported me. Grateful for the garden that had healed me. Grateful for Sarah, whose memory had inspired me to create something meaningful. The next Saturday at the farmers' market, Mrs. Rodriguez brought me homemade tamales. "To celebrate your award," she said. "You deserve to be recognized for what you do." "The award is nice," I told her, "but this is the real reward." I gestured around the market at the vendors setting up, the early customers browsing, the children running between stalls. This community, these connections. This is what I was fighting for. She patted my hand. "You're a good man, Warren Turner. Your wife would be proud." The season wound down as October turned to November. On the last market day of the year, vendors and customers lingered longer than usual, reluctant to say goodbye until spring. We made plans for the winter, promised to stay in touch, talked about next year's crops and new ideas. As I drove home with my empty truck, I thought about how far I had come. 2.5 years ago, I had been a widower trying to find meaning in a world that no longer made sense. Now I was a community leader, an advocate, a teacher. A friend to dozens of people I might never have met if Deborah Fitzpatrick hadn't tried to shut down my farmer's market operation. In a strange way, I owed her a debt of gratitude. Her opposition had forced me to fight, and fighting had forced me to engage with my community in ways I never would have otherwise. She had tried to isolate me, and instead had connected me to hundreds of people who shared my values. The winter months passed quietly. I spent time planning the next year's garden, experimenting with seeds starting in my greenhouse, teaching workshops at the community center. I stayed in touch with my market customers through social media, sharing recipes and growing tips and countdowns to the spring season. In March, I received an invitation to speak at a national sustainable agriculture conference in Des Moines. They wanted me to talk about grassroots organizing and community support for local food systems. I accepted, honored to share my story on a larger stage. The conference was energizing. I met farmers and activists from across the country, all working to build stronger local food systems. My presentation was well received, and afterwards, I had conversations with people who were facing similar challenges with HOAs, zoning boards, and other regulatory bodies. The key is not to fight alone, I told them. Build your community first. Make sure people understand what's at stake. When you have community support, it's much harder for bureaucrats to shut you down. Flying home, I felt a sense of purpose that extended beyond my own garden and market stand. Maybe I could help other people navigate the challenges I had faced. Maybe my experience could make their fights a little easier. The farmers' market season opened in April to the biggest crowd yet. The local news ran a story about the market's growth and my role in defending it from the HOA challenge. New vendors had joined, expanding our offerings to include cheese, bread, honey, and prepared foods. On that first Saturday, as I sold the early spring vegetables I had nurtured through the last cold weeks of winter, I looked around at what we had built together. This wasn't just a market. It was a community institution, a weekly gathering place, a celebration of local food and human connection. A young man approached my stand, looking nervous. "Are you Warren Turner?" "I am. I just moved to Riverside, into Deborah Fitzpatrick's old house, actually. The realtor told me the whole story about the HOA fight. I wanted to let you know that I'm starting my own garden, inspired by what you did. And if there's ever any trouble again, you'll have my support." I shook his hand, moved by the gesture. "Welcome to the neighborhood, and thank you, but I don't think there will be any more trouble. I think we've established that this community values gardens and farmers' markets and people who contribute rather than complain." He grinned. "Good to hear. Oh, and my wife and I are vegetarian, so we're going to be your best customers." As the day went on, I thought about the chain of events that had led to this moment. Sarah's death and my grief. The garden that became my therapy. The farmer's market that became my purpose. The HOA fight that became my education in community organizing. And now, this thriving market and garden that had become my legacy. Everything was connected. Every challenge had led to growth. Every setback had revealed new strengths. Every ending had contained the seeds of a new beginning. When I got home that evening, I walked to the backyard and stood among my raised beds, watching the sun set over the garden. The plants were just starting to grow, tender seedlings reaching toward the light, full of potential and promise. "We did it," I whispered, and I wasn't sure if I was talking to Sarah, to myself, or to the plants themselves. "We built something that matters." The breeze rustled through the leaves, and for a moment, I could almost hear Sarah's voice, proud and loving, telling me she had always known I could do it. I smiled, wiped my eyes, and started planning tomorrow's work. There were always more seeds to plant, more food to grow, more community to build. The fight with the HOA was over, but the real work, the important work, continued every day in gardens and markets and connections between people who cared about the same things. That was the real victory. Not defeating Deborah Fitzpatrick or changing HOA rules, but creating something positive and lasting that would continue long after all the conflicts were forgotten. A community that valued local food, sustainable practices, and neighbors helping neighbors. A legacy that honored Sarah's memory while building something new and vital. As darkness fell and lights came on in houses across the neighborhood, I felt a deep sense of belonging. This was home, not just the house or the garden, but the community. The people who had stood with me when it mattered. The customers who had become friends. The neighbors who had defended my right to do work that mattered. Deborah Fitzpatrick had tried to drive me out, to silence me, to enforce her narrow vision of what the neighborhood should be. Instead, she had helped create something better than anything I could have imagined alone. She had forced me to find my voice, to connect with my community, to stand up for what I believed in. For that, in the end, I was grateful. The struggle had made everything that followed more meaningful. The victory had been sweeter because it was hard-won. The community had been stronger because it was tested. As I locked up the greenhouse and headed inside for the night, I thought about all the people out there facing similar fights. Fighting HOAs and zoning boards and bureaucrats who valued rules over people. I hoped my story could give them courage. I hoped they would know they weren't alone. I hoped they would fight back and win, just as I had, because in the end, that's what community is about. Standing together. Supporting each other. Refusing to let arbitrary rules and petty tyrants diminish what makes life worth living. Gardens and markets and friendships and food and all the simple, profound things that connect us to each other and to the earth. That night, I slept deeply and dreamlessly, at peace with myself and my choices. When morning came, I would return to the garden, continue the work, build on what we had created together. The fight was over, but the story continued, one seed at a time, one customer at a time, one season at a time. And that was exactly how it should be.